thank you all for I was going to say staying, but of course you're staying because it's a great show overall. But thank you for being here for our panel. We tried to choose a case study that could highlight a lot of the things that have been discussed in the last couple of hours. And so we've chosen something in Ukraine, not because Ukraine is super topical these days, but because probably 4 or 5 years ago we got involved in this situation, and it went through the whole life cycle of what distressed situations can do, and in this case did, despite the fact that it was in Ukraine and despite the fact that we faced all kinds of difficulties. So I thought it would be interesting for all of you to hear, not that emerging market special situations is toxic and should be avoided, but actually that in those special situations, and as Dan mentioned in his speech, there are a lot of those these days. Since when this one was done, the size of the debt stack, the size of the debt market was probably $1 trillion, and today it's more than $2.5 trillion. But when you look at these situations, they may be victims of illiquidity, they may be victims of sometimes fraud, and we'll hear a bit about that in this case. But the result is that you have asset-led companies that are quite interesting. And so despite all the difficulty, we found as a firm that the opportunity set is tremendous. And I think, as many of the speakers have said, that's certainly the case today. So I'm going to ask Giovanni to give you the background, because as it happens, these two, Giovanni and Andrea, were involved in this before we were involved in it, because we found the opportunity attractive after they had taken the first steps. So the true experts are with us here as well. So I'll let you, Giovanni, go through the background. And we have some slides, I think. And by one note, of course, Alex is not here because he has COVID, but we'll do our best to talk through the legal aspects of this as well.
No, thank you, John, and thank you to the organizer for giving me the opportunity of speaking to you today. No, I mean, in a career of an investment banker, there are few projects which are defining, and certainly MRIA has been one of them, at least as far as I'm concerned. It is a unique case study which has also been taken by a professor of INSEAD, it's circulating, and the specificity is that the background of Ukraine is very complex. It is a repossession of, debt-based takeover, stabilization and restructuring, and an exit. All the three against a very complicated legal framework and economic background of Ukraine that you can imagine is a complicated one. It took 4 years, all the cycle took 4 years, and when I started, I have hairs like John. And he was involved as well, but I was the one on the ground, and he was more like in London and New York. So I looked better for sure. But nevertheless, it was a big success. But maybe where we can start from is to give you a bit of a background on what is MRIA, how the story started. And I don't know if there is a slide. Yeah. MRIA is an agribusiness which is producing agriculture things like cereals, grain, and it was established in Ukraine with the collapse of Soviet Union. Very small business, initially 50 hectares. It was established by the family Guta, by the father Guta, Ivan Guta, to be precise. 50 hectares, then 100, then 200. Then after a few years, cutting some corners, I got to 1,000, 1,500, kind of becoming serious business. At a certain point, 15 years later, with the economic development of Ukraine, the children of Ivan Guta took over. 2 children, Western educated, very ambitious, Mikola and Andrei. And they were very ambitious and also a bit aggressive. And they wanted to turn MRIA, which was a mid-sized company, in a global powerhouse of agriculture, and for sure one of the leaders in Ukraine. They've been quite lucky. Before the financial crisis, just before in 2008, they managed to make a private placement of $90 million for a pretty high valuation of $450 million, 20% of a company. Pretty high valuation on a junior listed market in Frankfurt that were with no audit. I mean, it was a bit of, those were the days of very risky investors with the past eventually. So they went through the financial crisis quite well. They were sitting on money, and that when I start meeting them, because they had a certain money, and then I met with them, and they wanted to do an IPO, they wanted to do Eurobonds. And we actually advised them in preparing the first Eurobond, $250 million of Eurobonds, which was a debut Eurobond. And at that time, they raised this money. So they raised the 90 million quite easily, strangely also. $250 million relatively easily because it was the market in 2011 was quite positive for emerging market. And so they understood that it was pretty easy to raise money. And they become even more, aggressive. So with all this money in their pockets, they started expanding the business. They funded businesses outside of the company. They funded the bank. And they even started snobbing me because okay, I'm not speaking with bankers, I'm speaking only with principal. You speak with a CFO. So I kind of lost connection with them. Comes 2014, when Crimea has been annexed by Russia and the war in Donbass start, the Western banks stopped funding the business all of a sudden. And the game that they put together, which was like a kind of, afterwards, it became apparent to the Ponzi scheme, stopped because they couldn't refinance the debt. So what happened at that point is that creditors called us as advisor because we are quite well established in Ukraine and we knew the company well. And we found out a number of interesting things. First of all, the land bank, increased significantly to 298 or 300 declared 1,000 hectares. This is like half of Belgium, just to give you an idea. Pretty big land bank. They declared to have an EBITDA of $227 million in 2013 and a debt in theory of 600. When we look into the company, we found out three things. First, the debt was $1.1 billion instead of 600. There were 300 million of undeclared guarantees. Second, the EBITDA that they keep saying is 200, 250, in reality was 60, 70. Most of the best case, sometimes 80. And third, a lot of the money that they raised, like $300-400 million, had been stolen, basically. Taken out from the company and invested in lavish lifestyle, but also some adventurous projects. And the company defaulted then. Company defaulted, and here we go to the next side of the story, I believe.
Yeah, this is a slide to talk about who was involved and at the beginning. And I think you've heard from Giovanni, and we wanted to describe your role since this is a...
Well, our role was, we started as a simple advisor advising the bonds. There were Eurobonds, 27 banks, secured, unsecured, 6 or 7 jurisdictions involved. Russian banks, Ukrainian banks, European banks, American banks, and 2 series of bonds. So very complicated stuff. At the beginning, we advised the bonds. Then we advised also the banks, which was desperate enough. Then also the IFI, like IFC was involved. And we put together all the different creditors classes, but with the same fundamental objective of making a little bit of order in this company. And we also had, on behalf of all these creditors, select a new management team, which eventually, once we took control of the company, we put in place. And after we advised on the actual financial restructuring of the business and on the sale, but maybe I think what is interesting is now to understand what happened when we accelerated the bonds. Because one thing is important to say, when we had all these $1.1 billion of creditors behind us, we started negotiation with the owners, which eventually were also fraudsters, and we started also criminal case against them. And as a result, negotiations were impossible, were also quite difficult, as you can imagine. The shareholder left the country, fled the country. Some of them have been arrested. And we took control, we accelerated the bonds. So we indemnified the trustee, and we accelerated the bonds. And I think from that onwards, maybe Andri can provide an overview of what happened with after the acceleration of the bonds.
So I'm Andrea Antonio. I'm from T.R.I. Group in Cyprus. We've heard about Ukraine being involved here, but no mention of Cyprus. So how did we come on board? Well, MRI Agro Holding was a Cyprus-registered holding company of the group, and ultimately we had to find a way to take control of the operations if there was going to be any chance of salvaging the business and restructuring in order to sell on. The way that we ultimately did that was by applying to court, the Cypriot court, for the liquidation of MRIA. Now, the Cypriot court can be somewhat unpredictable. In this case, however, we didn't just apply for liquidation, because if we had, it would have taken, at best, sort of 6 months. At worst, if it was opposed, it could have taken a couple of years to get the company wound up. Instead, because of the evidence of asset dissipation and misappropriation, and also because of the pending criminal actions, I think, and the red notice pending against one of the gutters, we were able to persuade the court that there was enough evidence of fraud to appoint what's called a provisional liquidator. So within 4 days of the petition being made, the court appointed our CEO, sat over there, as provisional liquidator. And shortly after that, we were able to change the boards of the subsidiaries, give powers of attorney to individuals on the ground who are able to run the business, because of course one of the advantages of liquidation is that the powers of the director cease upon the appointment of the liquidator or the provisional liquidator. But of course the liquidator has control of the holding company, but we needed to have control of not only the Cyprus subsidiaries but also the Ukrainian operations. And we did that through using, if you like, the insolvency tool of liquidation to ultimately have the control of the group. And also appointed in Ukraine, through powers of attorney, financial advisors and lawyers who were able to start working on the restructuring of the group quite quickly, although it did eventually take 3 years by the time we got there, because of the complications. But once we had the control of the group and were able to raise working capital, it meant that, well, it wasn't so key whether it was done immediately and within a few months or whether it took a bit longer. We were able to continue trading because by that point we had everything in place. So the trading and taking control is one aspect of what we did through the liquidation. The other aspect and big part of the role of the liquidator is also investigating the affairs of the company, and through that trying to identify sort of what actually happened, where did the money go. Here, like I think Giovanni mentioned, there was a sort of 300 million hole in the finances. Now, we believe a lot of that money was actually put back into the company, whether it was by form of loans to inflate the profits, make it more interesting and more a better investment. And what we also identified was various schemes. For example, 100 million of company funds were spent on allegedly purchasing companies, except those companies were empty shelf companies. And there were a lot of red flags for the banks that were involved in this. They should have stopped these transactions. And I believe had this happened today, they wouldn't have got away with it, and the money would never have been allowed to be transferred. But especially the banks in Cyprus at the time, they were a little bit more lax, I'd say, than they are today. So once we did identify various schemes, and for that we had to take legal actions in various jurisdictions, including BVI and Switzerland, and obtain disclosure orders, for example. Since then, we filed legal actions, both civil and criminal, against the Gutter family, and also civil actions against the banks that were involved. But these things do take a very long time, and we're still in court today. We have managed to get a worldwide freezing order against some assets, but the legal actions are still pending. So although you mentioned before that it was you were in and out within 4 years. Well, we're still there. So by the time I'm out, maybe I'll also have a few more grey hairs. And so but yeah.
But that
so
is
that's
good.
where-
That is good. It should
Yeah.
last for the people which are taking the money illegally as long as possible.
Well,
but,
it shouldn't. It really.
as an
There should be.
investment.
I think there should be better mechanisms in place
Ah,
for
yeah,
them
sure.
to pay, right?
Right.
But yeah, I think they're in Switzerland maybe today.
Yeah.
But one thing I would like to say, because
Yeah,
you
go
say taking over the legal entities, there were 150 legal entities, and it's taking them over, and it's not like a company, you have a factory, a production facility, and that's it. 250,000 hectares, which is spread all around the countries. You have tractors here, you have companies there, deposits there, grain. So when we tried to take it over with probably 50 lawyers were involved, it was really a nightmare because you had, somebody was stealing the grain here, the tractor was stolen there. So you were trying to put the hands on the company, and it was very, very fragmented type of business. And things were being stolen every time, a bit by the management, a bit by the shareholder, former partners. It was eventually we managed to do it, but we lost, down the road, we lost a lot of value in this phase.
So, but while these guys were working hard on the ground and trying to get control of the situation, we were happily not involved, in fact, at that stage, because we were watching the situation. And as this happened, I think the other holders of the debt started to realize it was a much more complicated story than necessarily they had thought. Because of course, many people had bought the bonds at par, thinking there were 320,000 hectares of land, and the Gutas at that point were the darlings of the agri-space in Ukraine. So. I think when we first looked at this, actually, it was to acquire the IFC's debt, which was a senior secured position. That was in May, before you guys had really taken over. But the IFC never really sells stuff, in my experience, and they weren't really selling it. They were just testing the market, so we didn't actually do that. But I remember it was the first I'd really just started at Black River at that point, and I'd written this big memo, and I was really excited about it, but then there was nothing to do. So then more like 8 months later, the bonds at this point are trading at 8 cents or 7 cents, and the situation was, much more stable in a way, but still much different than what the market had perceived it was before. And yet, from our perspective, we perceived it as still a very strategic asset. It may not have been 320,000 hectares, but I think we're in the Middle East now, and we can understand why 150,000 hectares, which may be only a quarter the size of Belgium, is still interesting from a food security perspective. And so our perspective was, we knew the management team at that point because it happened. Simon was an old friend of mine as well, the CEO. So sorry, this microphone's coming out. But we decided to get involved and were able to secure the largest bondholders position and their incentive from the original working capital piece. So it meant that from our perspective, the returns looked quite attractive. So that was the beginning of our entrance. And it was also at a time, I think, when all these creditors were like, the old banks were saying, you need to respect us because we're old European banks, and the bondholders were just looking to find a solution. The IFIs, like the IFC and others, were really avoiding engaging at all in many respects, as were some of the local senior secured banks, because they have a very different mentality about restructuring at that point. So I think it was a good opportunity for us to also team up with you guys and push it through, which is, I think it took us some time, but from February, these last 3 things are when we actually consolidated control and were able to finalize the actual restructuring of the situation.
Yeah, shall we go to the next one?
Yeah.
Well, eventually, it was a nightmare to put together all these people and these intercreditor positions, but eventually we managed to do together a pretty interesting restructuring where, as you can see, we had both the bonds and unsecured have been reconverted for a great majority into equity. Part of a secured banks have remained secured, and we have also issued some restructuring notes which have been distributed to the initial creditor. So the financial structure was still stretched comparing with the financials, but definitely with this level of equitization was much more sustainable than it was before. And then I don't know if I should pass already to the next stage about the exit. Or
Yeah, sure. But let me just make a couple of points quickly.
Sure.
One is that in this case, we made actual precedents for the first time in Ukraine, and I think probably for one of the first times in the former Soviet Union. Foreign creditors actually took control together with the liquidator and took control and turned the company around and then ultimately sold it. We're going to talk about the exit in a minute, but I think that isn't to be. It was a serious example of what some of the previous members of the panel were talking about is routine in the Western world. But I think it was my point at the beginning. It should underscore for everybody that the opportunities are maybe a little more complicated, and maybe they require a bit more understanding about the local dynamics, and you need to have very strong local legal partners as well. But at the end of the day, the opportunity set is extremely compelling in emerging markets because these companies have real strategic value to so many other parts of the world. So let's talk about the exit.
Yeah, once the company has been stabilized and restructured, then we run, because the creditors, including Argentum and John, were not strategic investor, and at a certain point they wanted to exit. So we ran a process, very limited one, and we got quite a considerable interest from Ukrainian investor as well as international. Eventually, the best bidder was a Saudi group, engaged in food security, which was very determined. It was quite a long and thorough due diligence negotiation, but we managed to sell it for a pretty significant amount compared to the peers. So it was pretty satisfactory. Of course, the people which lended money at the beginning at par against an EBITDA which didn't exist, and again an inflated land bank, and against a debt which was much higher, they lost money. But people like John, which came in at the right moment and with the right pricing, made quite a lot of money.
But worth saying we also saved 2,000 jobs in that process in rural
absolutely.
Ukraine, which I think is a real thing.
Absolutely. The buyer invested, as soon as they invested, they committed under $50 million for the development of the company. And 3,000 jobs have been reserved and development. And at least until last year, as we are talking about Ukraine, your question would be, okay, what happened now? There is a war, but worth to mention that yes, of course, this year has not been easy for anyone in Ukraine, but last year was very good for them, and this company is based on the western side of the country, so in a way a little bit more insulated by what terrible things are happening on the east. So we are still very happy about the investment they made.
Yep. So that's our case study, and I think, as I said, I think it underscores how, in even difficult circumstances, the opportunity set is quite compelling. And working together with advisors, with liquidators, with investors, the results are quite positive. So anyway, I'm hoping that all of you very qualified audience members have questions for us.
So what was the regulatory environment in Ukraine at the time, and how it supported or otherwise restricted you from doing your difficult exercise?
That's a very good question. I forgot to mention. We had to change the law. We had to change the law because there was no adequate debt restructuring legislation. So we helped in devising a legislation which would enable the conversion of debt into equity for local creditors. It was a different level done at the local level, international level, because you are all different type of creditor, local and different governing law. So it was quite complicated. But eventually we uniformed all the exposures, except for the secured ones, into one class of securities, equity and the subordinated note. But it was the legal framework was not really there. It has been on the back of that. It has been further perfectioned in the meantime. So now it's quite a good one in terms of debt restructuring. But this exercise helped also the regulation to improve in a way.
I think it's worth saying too that we had great local lawyers. I mean, we had almost all of them actually, because we had so many constituencies. But we had Sanka, Horenko, and Avellum, and I think that with those two together enabled us really to set some real precedents and make changes to the law. I mean, it was a non-trivial exercise, but with the quality of people available in a market like that, it stands to reason. And I think our experience has been in other markets. It also applies to not just Ukraine. It applies to Indonesia. It applies to China, of course. It applies to lots of these markets that, again, you might say, well, I don't want to invest there. I'd rather invest in the United States. But actually, the opportunity set is there partly because you can work with people like that to change the law, which is harder in some of the more established jurisdictions. So I think that's a good question and a good point to make.
Yeah, I think if you manage to, if you are able to manage complexity and you know the place and you have a right partner, what you can get returns from this situation higher than the standard one, which everyone is looking at, and a competitive process. But of course, you need to have a lot of very critical ingredients to be successful, and a bit of luck as well.
Of course,
Yeah.
Which
that's true in every
which
case.
is never, which is never useless.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Mr. Chapman.
I promised I wouldn't ask you a question, John, so
Okay.
I'll pose it to Giovanni.
Perfect,
instead.
perfect.
But one of the most fascinating parts of this investment, from my perspective, was how you guys were able to work with the Ukrainian government related to corruption, amongst other things, local level versus federal level. That, I think, was a big success story for the country. And, I think we get asked ESG questions all the time as a firm. So could you comment on that?
Thank you for the question.
You're welcome. Yeah, feel free to have John answer.
No problem. No, I mean, Ukraine is a place which is ranking quite high in the corruption. I mean, like most of the CIS, no, not worse. But I have to say, it's also a place that if you are right and you do the right things, you might lose a certain battles, but in the end you win. Differently from other places where maybe if you are opposed to a big power, you have no hopes. I'm not mentioning any country. But if you are against the big power, there is no hope, basically. In Ukraine, if you are right and you do the right things and you don't give up, eventually you get there. Because they're different. It's a bit, talking about balancing of power sounds too much American. It's a bit of a messy of power, but a bit balancing and taking shape. But eventually it's not a monolithic part of a power that can block you other things. So you can get the things through. Of course, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of efforts and a lot of distress, but eventually I think you can get the things through properly.
I read in the previous slide that Argentum stepped in and bought big stake of the debt. Do you think this is the reason for success, or some other investor can step in, or suppose there's no investor? Would this be a successful story or not?
It's a good question. I think it's an element of the success. I think what you need in any credit committee, whether it's us or somebody else, or an existing investor, you need someone who's willing to provide some leadership. Because often the investors on a credit committee, in this case, the credit committee, there were two credit committees. There was a secured lenders and an unsecured lenders and a bondholder committee. I think in both cases there was a degree of fatigue, and there was no dynamic there to drive it through. So I think we did provide that, and if we hadn't have been there, there might have been another bondholder. There were some other professional that we know that might have done it, but you always need something there. So if there'd been no driver, in fact, to really give it to the next level, it would have been harder. It would have taken longer. It might have still succeeded because I think you guys were hired and were being paid to do things, and there were a lot of elements there that were being driven to move it forward. But it did help to have capital. I mean, one of the things that we also did at that time for the second fundraising, for the second dip, was we brought the cornerstone investment for that second dip, which I think, of course, pushed it forward because there was a real gap in what was required, and without it, I think it would have been difficult. But it's hard to say whether someone else might have stepped in or not, but I guess in that case we did and took that leadership.
No, I think without Argentum, it would have been very difficult for the simple reason that the people which were funding this business when it was supposed to be a going concern, everything was like long and very conservative type of banks and institutions, which when the situation exploded, they were unable, it's not their turf, and you need someone who understands and spend time, or even bondholders, they are traders, they don't want to spend time. This is very complex things. You need someone which gets inside and can calculate the risk and make the right bet and drive the others. The others followed eventually, but they were not leaders, so we need someone like Argentum and John.
We did buy the piece from an investor who had a piece of every piece of distressed debt in the market at that point. So just to your point, I mean, I think there's a limited amount of time, and if you pick one, you know, as an investor, we, of course, it was a 15% position in our fund at one stage. So we didn't have a portfolio of 50 things to look at. That's not, we're much more like a private equity fund like that, where we have real hands-on in those situations. So
one of the common themes we're seeing in this crisis, in the NMC healthcare case study, even today, what we're hearing about is going on in crypto is fraud being the prerequisite towards these restructuring and solvency situations emerging when we're at the peak of the bubble, the crisis, and money starts being misused. So going forward, based on your experience, what additional safeguards and protocols can we put in place as we go into a new cycle? Do you think that can address some of these issues and prevent some of these fraud crises occurring again?
you want to try that?
Well, I mean, going by the type of fraud that was identified here, I think a lot of it wouldn't be repeated only because of the compliance that the banks do alone. There's no way that the transactions we've seen here would have been allowed to happen today. I mean, giving a bank a 3-page SPA and asking it to go ahead and transfer tens of millions, I mean, there's no substance there whatsoever. Company was never even, Maria never even received these shares of these empty shell companies, but yet it paid 100 million. And potentially the bank here alone is actually liable for that. But of course, the nature of the beast, the liquidator doesn't have ends of big pots of money to keep throwing at these legal actions. So I think an element of it would be eliminated just because of the tighter controls of the banks.
Yeah, if I may compliment as well, I think it will be very difficult for something like this would happen again, because to be honest, there was a bit of ingenuity and from the side of the creditors at the beginning. There were so many red flags in this company in terms of governance, which was all the family, concentrated with the family, effectively. And many other things like related party transaction and many red flags which could be spotted, but no one was actually paying a lot of attention. And they could, the metric, for instance, Maria had metrics of harvesting per hectare which were 4 times higher than the average. It's kind of how a farming business can have 4 times tons per hectare than the average of industry. One could ask. I mean, of course, they were saying they were super good and they had a new technology, but it's agribusiness. It's not particularly complicated. I mean, it's complicated, but not so differentiating in terms of production technologies. I think something like this today couldn't happen, but at that time, there was a lot of liquidity in the market. It was after global financial crisis, and this thing didn't happen before. Now I would say that whoever is looking and having 27 banks plus probably 50, 60 big bondholders is like half of the financial system of Europe, at least, somehow involved. They got the lesson, and I believe that something like this could not happen anymore. Also because of regulation, which has become much more reliable and stringent. Of course, there could be new type of frauds in the future, but is this kind unlikely?
But it's an interesting thing to think about, because we've been through. I hate to date myself, but I was doing restructuring when I was at Credit Suisse in the late '90s in Russia, when there was a range of situations which were somewhat analogous, because there was some of them had fraud as well. And I think in markets like the Bitcoin market, it may be the people who are there haven't actually experienced it. Once you've experienced it, you know what the hallmark signs are. But certainly if you, as an investor, think about governance, that's critical to the decision about whether you invest or not. And if there's failings in governance, it's usually a sign of there being trouble. And once you see that, then you can dig a little deeper. And when things are too good to be true, they usually are, unfortunately, too good to be true. So I think probably you have all the tools in your box to tell when this sort of thing comes. I'm making no comments about recent news flows about crypto, because it's not a sector I look at, but it strikes me that there's some analogous question marks that maybe some people should have raised had they been through a few cycles of this sort of thing and seen it.
Sorry, what was the role of the auditors in this disaster?
Oh, that's a good question.
Auditors, yeah.
Yeah, and it was, by the way, not a good one.
We actually obtained legal advice. The liquidator obtained legal advice from from UK law firm as to whether we could go after the auditors. But because of the disclaimers that were entered in their engagement terms, limiting their exposure, it just wasn't worth it. So we didn't dig too deep into that.
Yeah, and we are talking about the Big Four, which I'm not going to mention, but it was a pretty, ugly story, yes. And the problem is also when you have these situations, and let's be honest, you are there, you take over a company, but you don't have a lot of liquidity. You are struggling to survive. Of course, they invested in the securities, but you calculate the money that you have quite tightly, and then there are always problems coming up. Fights back from the former shareholder in different ways, which are trying to torpedo what you're doing, and to go after these kind of big guys, you need to be ready to spend millions, and that's a problem that in certain situation, not all the time this is a priority. Priority to save a company, to know a way to get out, but this is also going after the former shareholder in different jurisdictions. It requires a lot of money. So I'm afraid that this is a bad lessons also that we learned that it's not so easy to go after when there are complicated structures like this worldwide.
They often get different jurisdictions involved, I think, on purpose, because it makes it so much more difficult to unravel, and so costly as well.
It costs money, you need to spend, okay, let's go, but start with 300,000, okay. And then 500,000, okay, it's not, peanuts. Even if you're right, if you're all,
It's worth saying, though, that's a perfect example of one of the things that if you're making a big investment in a company and anywhere, it doesn't matter. This is a big four, so it happened to be in Ukraine, but it doesn't make a difference. There's so many competing interests among these firms about how they do things. You have to, if something's too good to be true, like the production, the productivity is 4 times better than any of the comps, well, then there's more questions to be asked, even if the audit looks okay sometimes. So thank you very much.